Welcome to our 11th class on the Christian basics, or for my Lutheran teenagers out there, confirmation. Every week we aim to bring you biblical content that helps you with your new or emerging walk with Christ. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor down at First Lutheran in Houston, Texas. And this week we're looking at the book of Joshua and really at the surrounding issues of the conquest of the Promised Land. Let's roll. Well, at the very end of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we see that Moses dies. He doesn't get to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land. Rather, that task is given to Joshua. So the book of Joshua is full of military conquests and battles that are really about Joshua being the leader of the people as they go into the land that God promised them. Now, interesting fact, you might know that Joshua has the same name as Jesus. You see, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and the New Testament was written in Greek. And in Hebrew, the name Joshua is Yeshua. And that was also what Jesus' name was, Yeshua. But when they moved from Hebrew to Greek, Yeshua became Jesus. And so we've just gone from there, and so Jesus eventually became Jesus. But as you hear these stories about Joshua's bravery and conquest, you should also be thinking about Jesus. For just as Joshua led the people into the Promised Land through military conquest and victory, Jesus leads his people not into the nation of Israel or anything like that, but rather into the Promised Land of the new heavens and the new earth. What is the first thing that Joshua did? Well, they had to cross the Jordan River. The Jordan River was really a boundary, if you will, a spiritual boundary, but also a physical boundary between what we would now call the land of Israel and not the land of Israel. And something else very important happens in the Jordan River. In the New Testament, we see that Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. So there seems to be a connection there. So really the crossing of the Jordan marks the end of the Israelites' time in the wilderness. It's really a new beginning. And just as Moses parted the Red Sea miraculously, Joshua is said to do the same. Water parts, and the Israelites, again, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, are able to enter into this land. And they're also to put 12 stones into this water. They put them there as a memorial so that later people can go back if they doubt the story and they can see those 12 stones. Now, the Jordan River is pretty big. I don't know that we could find those 12 stones today, but I think they're there somewhere. And the point was that you can find these stones later, and this is the story of our fathers, how we got into the Promised Land. But so far, that's the easy part. The hard part is, what do you do with all the people who are already there? Right? I mean, the land wasn't empty. There were people living there. And it was promised to people who worshiped the one God of the universe, not the people who are living there who are not worshiping that God, but in fact were worshiping false gods that are going to come up again and again in the Old Testament. And so one of the things that you're going to encounter as a Christian is you're going to encounter unbelievers citing these stories, many of which are in Joshua, about how the Israelites went into land, they killed a bunch of people, and what does that say about God? Now, I thought God was nice and he loved us, and here are stories about Israelites going into land and conquering land for their own purposes. So what do we do with these stories? I mean, you really do need to know what to do with these arguments. So I'm not going to go into the battles here. You may have heard of some of them, like Jericho is a famous battle. They walk around the city 7 times, they blow trumpets, the walls fall down. That's a more famous story. And you may have heard of some of the people groups that the Israelites conquer. The Canaanites are one of those groups. So yes, Joshua tells the story of military conquests at God's hand, indeed at God's command. So were these people innocent victims of a mean and terrible God? No. Let me tell you a little bit about these people. These were not good people, as we would say today, just sort of minding their own affairs and doing nothing that might cause offense to God. In fact, they were sinful people, Let me quote at some length from an article that's from the Gospel Coalition website. If we take the Bible on its own terms, we will recognize that all humans are born guilty and corrupt. This was especially true of the Canaanite society, steeped in abominable practices like child sacrifice and cult prostitution. Old Testament scholar Trimper Longman summarizes this point well. We must point out that the Bible does not understand the destruction of the men, women, and children of these cities as a slaughter of innocents. Not even the children are considered innocent. They are all part of an inherently wicked culture that, if allowed to live, would morally and theologically pollute the people of Israel. Yes, you see, those who dwelt in the land, they weren't good people. They were doing horrible things like offering their children up to gods to burn them alive as a sacrifice. If people did that today, we'd wage a war against them ourselves, wouldn't we? More to the point, God is holy, and God is the creator of all. God is well within his rights to execute justice against people who are doing evil deeds. In fact, God is well within his rights to take my life right now. I don't have a right to life in that sense from God's point of view. So when people have done horrible things against one another, then God is certainly even more, if you will, well within his rights. You see, as a Christian, I think actually this is what you really have to defend more than anything else, or maybe just understand, which is that God has the right and the prerogative to judge the world according to his standard. You know, God doesn't just promise us 82 years of peaceful living, where we die surrounded by our loved ones peacefully in bed and everything during our life will always be good. No, we live in God's world. We must live by his standard. His holiness should be defended at all times by all of those who call themselves Christians. That's actually what it means to, I think, be a sincere follower of Jesus Christ. Now, a few other important points. It is possible, and maybe even likely, that some of the Bible in the Old Testament about these conquests is somewhat exaggerated. For example, the Bible says in Deuteronomy 20:16-18, "But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to the complete destruction, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods. And so you sin against the Lord your God." Well, that sounds really, really harsh. But actually, the Canaanites do turn up later in the Bible, so even though the Israelites were supposed to wipe them all out, they actually didn't. Some were allowed to live, and you see them again later in the Old Testament. And maybe this is some exaggerated language. You know, like when we say we killed that other football team, we don't actually mean that we, took their life or anything like that. Well, you should also know a little something about the gods that the Israelites were often tempted to worship, the gods that were worshipped in the land that they were conquering in the book of Joshua. The first is Baal. He's the sun god of these people. And then there's Ashtoreth. She's a moon goddess, kind of the counterpart to Baal. And again, you'll hear those names over and over throughout the Old Testament because this worship of these gods is constantly a problem for the Israelites in the Old Testament, really until the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. But then there's Molech. He's the fire god. And all of these gods required sacrifice, including child sacrifice. They fostered superstition and fear and cruelty. And whenever the Israelites associate too much with the Canaanites, they often fall into worship of their gods and bad things happen. Well, eventually the Hebrews will win this land, but I assure you that's going to be something you're going to hear about from unbelievers and skeptics. They'll say, how can you worship a God that ordered the Israelites to do all of those evil things? But remember that none of us have any special rights from God. This is a one-time act. It's not how Christians are to behave. We're not to go around looking for parasites to slaughter or anything like that. It's part of the historical narrative. And these people were doing wicked things that deserve the judgment of God. And again, none of us has an ultimate right to life in the eyes of God. Well, hopefully that's helpful as you encounter those kinds of arguments against God, against the God of the Bible, against the God that we worship. And it also hopefully brings us into a greater awareness of the holiness of God and the prerogatives of God. A couple of different books that you might consider that are about these topics that offer, I think, slightly different takes on these questions. One would be Paul Cophan's Is God a Moral Monster? And the other is R.C. Sproul's The Holiness of God. And a lot of what I've said today is really more on Sproul's side of it, although I borrowed a little bit from Cophan's arguments as well. So those might be books to consider to study this issue more. But we're now getting into, as the Israelites are in the Promised Land, we're looking ahead now to the time when they have judges and prophets and kings, which really will lead us all the way to the building of the temple, the destruction of the temple, and some really, really interesting things. I've got 2 guests for the next 4 class, experts on Old Testament. I'm so glad they've agreed to come on. So I think you'll really enjoy the next 4 classes on the prophets and the kings. But until then, you can email me, christianbasicsclass@gmail.com. Go to the church website, flhouston.org. There you'll find all the videos and the worksheets in case you've just stumbled upon this one. This is a 50-course class meant to teach you the very basics of the Bible and Christianity. And until next time, take care.